Welcome back to Contemporary Conversations on Christian Classics, where we explore timeless Christian content that continues to inspire today.
It's great to be back.
We are diving back into Steven Charnock's The Existence and Attributes of God.
Yes, and in this section,
This
this part has me thinking a lot about my own prayer life.
Oh, really? Which part is that?
Well, we're on part 4 of chapter 4
Okay.
on spiritual worship, and Charnock is really getting real about distractions.
Oh.
You know those moments when you're really trying to pray or read the Bible, and suddenly you're mentally reorganizing your sock drawer?
Yes. The wandering mind during prayer. It's a struggle. I think it's a pretty universal experience.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Something we probably all struggle with, and Charnock acknowledges that.
Does he really?
Yeah, he calls them starts of the heart.
Starts of the heart. I like that.
He doesn't expect us to be completely free of them either.
That's good to hear.
What matters is how we respond when they pop up.
So it's not about achieving some kind of perfect focus where my mind is a blank slate. That's actually really reassuring because I've often felt like I'm failing at prayer when my mind wanders.
Right. That's a really common misconception. It's not about silencing every stray thought. It's more about where our attention is ultimately directed.
I see.
Charnock uses this analogy of an unwelcome guest knocking at your door.
Oh,
You can't stop the knock, but you don't have to invite them in.
right.
Offer them tea and let them take over your living room.
That's a great image. I can totally relate to that. So if I catch my mind drifting to what I'm making for dinner while I'm praying,
Yeah.
I don't need to panic.
Right.
I can just gently redirect my attention back to God.
Exactly. And you know, the very fact that you are fighting those distractions, that you're making that effort to refocus on God, shows that there's a spiritual principle at work in you. It's like there's a part of you that's drawn to God and wants to connect with him, even if another part of you gets easily sidetracked. Charnock would say that this struggle itself is evidence of the Spirit working within you,
Wow. That's encouraging to hear.
contending with the flesh.
It makes those distractions feel less like personal failures and more like part of the normal Christian experience.
Right.
But it still begs the question,
Yeah.
why is it so important to resist those distractions? Is it really such a big deal if my mind wanders a bit during prayer? I mean, God knows our thoughts anyway.
That's where we get to the heart of what Charnock is saying about spiritual worship. He's getting at this idea that God desires our spirit, that deep, heartfelt connection,
Okay.
more than any outward ritual.
So it's not just about saying the right words or going through the motions?
Not at all. He uses this powerful analogy of scarlet dye.
Okay.
The dye itself is far more valuable
Right.
than the plain clock it colors.
I see.
In the same way, the manner of our worship, the spirit in which we approach God, is what gives value to the outward actions.
Wow, that's really making me think.
Mm-hmm.
So I could say all the right prayers and do all the religious things, but if my heart isn't engaged, if I'm not truly present with God, it's basically meaningless.
That's the point Charnock is driving home.
Okay.
1,000 sacrifices with a cold heart are worth nothing.
Mm.
And on the flip side, even if our worship is imperfect, even if our minds wander a bit, if our heart is right, if we're sincerely seeking to connect with God,
Yes.
he receives it.
That's a huge relief, honestly.
Yeah.
Because let's be real, who hasn't spaced out during a sermon or found their mind wandering during prayer?
Right.
But it sounds like what really matters to God is the posture of our hearts,
Mm.
the genuine desire to connect with him.
Absolutely. And, you know, Charnock even addresses this idea of imperfections. He says that we shouldn't be discouraged if we don't always experience those
Sure.
intense emotional highs in our worship. He says there may be a sincerity of the heart where there wants a fervency of affection.
So it's not about trying to manufacture some kind of emotional experience.
Right. It's about being honest with God about where we're at, bringing him our distracted minds, our weary hearts, our doubts and fears,
Yeah.
and trusting that he meets us in those places. The sincerity of our desire to know and love him is what matters most.
I'm starting to see why these distractions are such a big deal to Charnock. It's not that God is keeping score of how many times our mind wanders.
Right.
It's that those distractions can be symptoms of a deeper issue, a heart that's not fully engaged with God.
You're getting it. It's like those distractions are little red flags signaling that something might be off in our relationship with God.
I see.
They're an invitation to pause, examine our hearts, and ask ourselves, what's really capturing my attention? What's vying for the throne of my heart?
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, this is getting a bit heavy. It's like Charnock is shining a spotlight on all the ways I fall short in my worship. And it's making me wonder, just how serious is it to neglect that inner spiritual connection with God?
Well, that's where Charnock really doesn't mince words.
Okay.
He straight up says that withholding our spirit from God is a form of contempt.
Whoa, contempt. That sounds intense.
He even compares it to ignoring a king while he's speaking to play with his dog.
Ouch. That image really drives the point home.
Yeah.
But why is it so offensive to God when we offer him half-hearted worship?
Charnock lays out 9 specific reasons.
9.
And they're all rooted in God's character
Okay.
and the nature of our relationship with him. He's basically saying that when we fail to engage our hearts in worship, we're essentially violating who God is.
Okay, I'm ready for this list, but can we break it down so it doesn't feel too overwhelming?
Absolutely. Let's take it step by step and see how these 9 points reveal the depth of what's at stake when we come to God in worship.
Perfect. Let's dive in.
Welcome back to Contemporary Conversations on Christian Classics. We're continuing our depth dive into Steven Charnock's The Existence and Attributes of God.
Okay.
And unpacking just why neglecting that inward spiritual connection during worship is a big deal.
We left off with Charnock dropping a truth bomb. Withholding our hearts from God in worship is a form of contempt.
Right.
And he has 9 reasons to back it up. That's a lot.
Yeah.
I'm ready to hear them, but honestly, I'm a little intimidated to hear how I might be disrespecting God
I understand.
without even realizing it.
I understand that. But remember, Charnock's goal isn't to shame us, but to help us understand just how high the stakes are when we come to God in worship.
That makes sense. So let's take a deep breath and dive into these 9 reasons.
Okay.
What's the first point he makes?
The first point is that it's against God's majesty.
Majesty, okay.
When we're distracted and disengaged in worship, it's as if we're treating the king of the universe like some random guy on the street.
So it's not just that we're failing to pay attention. It's that we're failing to grasp the magnitude of who we're dealing with.
Exactly. Imagine you're invited to meet the Queen of England.
Oh, wow.
You probably wouldn't show up in sweatpants scrolling through your phone the whole time.
Oh, definitely not.
Yeah.
I'd be on my best behavior, trying to soak up every moment and show my respect.
Right. And that's the kind of reverence we should be bringing to God in worship.
Okay.
He's infinitely greater than any earthly ruler, and he deserves our undivided attention and heartfelt adoration.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection between distractions and disrespect. It's like those wandering thoughts reveal that I haven't fully grasped the awe-inspiring majesty of God.
Right.
What's the second point Charnock makes?
The second point is that half-hearted worship goes against God's life.
Life, okay.
We're offering a dead, lifeless service to the living God. It's like we're treating him as if he were some distant, unfeeling deity rather than the vibrant, personal God who created us and longs for a relationship with us.
You know, that really hits home for me. I can see how going through the motions of worship without actually engaging my heart could make God feel more like a concept than a living, breathing person.
Right.
It's like I'm acknowledging his existence, but not actually relating to him as a living being.
That's a great insight, and it leads right into the third point, which is that it goes against God's infiniteness.
The infiniteness, okay.
Our worship should reflect God's boundless nature.
Okay.
His limitless perfection. But when we offer him these tiny, finite affections, it's almost insulting.
Wow.
It's like we're trying to contain the ocean in a teacup.
Wow, that really puts things into perspective.
Yep.
If God is infinite, then anything less than our whole hearts is a vast understatement of who he is and what he deserves.
Right.
Okay, I'm ready for point number 4. What else does Charnock say?
He argues that half-hearted worship is also against God's spirituality.
Spirituality, okay.
We're spiritual beings created to connect with God on a spiritual level, but when our worship is merely external, it misses the mark entirely. It's like trying to have a deep conversation with someone while staring at your phone the whole time. You're physically present, but not mentally or emotionally engaged.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like I can show up at church, sing the songs, and even say the prayers.
Right.
But if my spirit isn't actively communing with God, it's all just a performance.
Exactly. And this ties in directly to the fifth point.
Okay.
Which is that it goes against God's supremacy.
Okay, supremacy.
God is the ultimate authority, the King of Kings. And yet when we let distractions reign in our hearts, it's like we're saying, actually, these other things are more important to me than you are.
So every time my mind wanders to my to-do list during prayer, I'm essentially dethroning God in my heart and replacing him with something else. That's a sobering thought.
It is, isn't it? It reveals where our true allegiance lies.
Right.
And, this idea of supremacy also plays out in how we order our lives.
Okay.
If we consistently prioritize everything else
Right.
over spending time with God, it sends a clear message
Okay.
about where our hearts truly are.
Okay. We're halfway through the list.
Oh,
What's the sixth point about?
The sixth point is that it's against God's wisdom.
Wisdom, okay.
God, in his wisdom, established an order in creation. He placed earthly things in subordination to heavenly things.
Okay.
And when we allow those lesser things to rule our hearts,
Right.
we're essentially inverting God's design.
It's like we're saying we know better than God. Like our priorities are more important than his.
And it's a subtle form of pride, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it actually sets us up for disappointment.
Yeah.
Because we'll never find true fulfillment in things that were never meant to be our ultimate source of satisfaction.
That's so true. It's like we're chasing after shadows when the real substance is found in God.
Right.
I'm starting to see how these distractions, these starts of the heart, are more than just minor annoyances. They're actually indicators of deeper heart issues that need to be addressed.
Exactly. And that leads right into point number 7, which is that it's against God's omniscience.
Omniscience, okay.
We might think we can fool God with our outward show of piety while our hearts are far from him.
Okay.
But God sees everything.
Yeah.
He knows our thoughts, our motives, the hidden desires of our hearts.
So it's not just about putting on a good show for God. It's about being authentic with him, even when it's messy.
Exactly. And that authenticity is what he desires most.
Yeah.
He doesn't want our pretense. He wants our hearts.
Okay, we're down to the last 2 points. What's next?
The 8th point is that half-hearted worship is against the holiness of God.
Holiness. Okay.
Charnock says that our base and carnal affections are like laying a heap of dung before a king's throne.
Oh my goodness.
It's an insult to his perfect purity.
Okay.
He's saying that God is holy, set apart, and he deserves to be approached with reverence and purity of heart.
So it's not just about cleaning up our outward actions. It's about purifying our hearts, our thoughts, our motives.
Precisely. True worship involves surrendering every part of ourselves to God.
Including the messy, broken parts that we'd rather keep hidden.
Okay, we've arrived at the final point on Charnock's list. What does he say about how neglecting spiritual worship goes against God?
This last one is a bit of a 2-for-1.
Oh.
It's against God's loving kindness.
Okay, love and kindness.
God condescends to allow us to approach him in worship, even though we're sinful and imperfect.
Yeah.
He gives us access to his presence, offers us pardon and fellowship. But when we respond with a cold and indifferent heart, we're essentially taking his grace for granted.
It's like we're saying, yeah, God, you're good and all.
Yeah.
But I've got more important things to think about.
It's a heartbreaking thought, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It's like we're rejecting the greatest gift we could ever receive.
Yeah.
And this actually ties into another point he makes.
Okay.
About God's sufficiency.
Also the sufficiency.
When we're constantly distracted by other things during worship,
right,
it implies that God isn't enough to satisfy us.
That we find more fulfillment elsewhere.
So our wandering thoughts aren't just about a lack of focus.
Right.
They're also a reflection of what we truly value and desire.
Exactly. They reveal what's competing for our attention and affection. And when those things take precedence over God, it grieves his heart.
Charnock certainly hasn't held back.
No, he hasn't.
He's painted a pretty stark picture of the consequences of neglecting spiritual worship.
Yeah.
It's definitely a wake-up call for me to examine my own heart.
Yeah.
And make sure I'm not treating God with contempt, even unintentionally.
Right.
But I have to admit, it's all feeling a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
How can we tell if our hearts are straying from God and worship? Are there any warning signs to look out for?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Thankfully, Charnock provides some helpful insights
Okay.
into how we can diagnose the state of our hearts.
Okay.
He points out a few key warning signs.
Yeah.
That our hearts might be more focused on earthly things than heavenly ones.
Okay, I'm all ears. What should I be watching out for?
The first sign he mentions is, you guessed it, a distracted spirit.
Okay.
He says that this actually reveals a deep-rooted corruption within us. It's a sign that our affections aren't fully set on God.
So those wandering thoughts aren't just random annoyances. They're actually symptoms of a deeper issue.
That's right.
Okay.
He's saying that if our hearts were truly captivated by God, we wouldn't be so easily pulled away by every little distraction.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like if I'm really engrossed in a movie, I don't even notice the notifications popping up on my phone.
Right.
But if I'm bored, my mind starts to wander to other things.
Exactly. It's the same with our hearts.
Okay.
If our hearts are truly enthralled by God, we'll naturally gravitate toward him even in the midst of distractions.
Right.
But if our affections are lukewarm,
Yeah.
we'll constantly be pulled away by the things of this world.
Okay, so distractions are red flag number one.
Mm-hmm.
What else should we be looking out for?
The second warning sign he mentions is a divided heart.
Okay, a divided heart.
This goes beyond mere distractions and points to a deeper conflict within us.
Okay.
It betrays a greater love for earthly things than for God.
So if I find myself more excited about my upcoming vacation than about spending time with God, that's a sign that my heart might be divided.
It could be.
Okay.
Of course, it's natural to enjoy the good things God has given us in this world.
Right.
But when those things consistently take precedence over God in our hearts, that's a problem. It's a sign that our affections are misaligned.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about keeping things in their proper order, right? God first, then the things of this world.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that nothing else can ultimately satisfy our souls the way God can.
All right, so we've got distractions and a divided heart. What's the final warning sign that Charnock points out?
This one cuts to the core of our integrity. Hypocrisy.
Okay, hypocrisy.
He says that a lack of spiritual engagement in worship exposes a disconnect between our outward actions and our inward reality.
Meaning we might be going through the motions of worship, but our hearts are far from God.
Exactly.
Right.
It's like we're putting on a religious performance.
Yeah.
But we're not truly living out our faith.
You know, that's something I really wrestle with.
Yeah.
I want to be authentic in my worship, but I also struggle with feeling like I'm not good enough. Like I have to pretend to be more spiritual than I actually am.
I think that's a common struggle. We put on these masks of piety,
Right.
afraid to let God see the real us.
Yeah.
But the truth is, God wants to see the real us, the messy, broken parts and all.
I'm hearing a theme here. It seems like the biggest danger in neglecting spiritual worship is that we end up living a divided life where our outward actions don't match what's going on in our hearts.
Right.
We present one face to God and another face to the world.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
And that kind of divided living ultimately leads to a sense of emptiness and dissatisfaction. It's only when we align our hearts with our actions, when we worship God in spirit and in truth, that we experience the fullness of life that he intends for us.
Okay. Charnock has definitely given us a lot to think about.
Yeah, he has.
And I have to admit, I'm feeling a little convicted right now. It's like he's held up a mirror to my soul, and I'm seeing all these areas where I need to grow. But I know this isn't where the story ends.
Right.
Charnock isn't just about pointing out our flaws.
Yeah.
He's also about offering solutions.
Yeah.
He gives us practical steps to cultivate a more spiritual approach to worship.
That's what's so great about Charnock.
Yeah.
He doesn't leave us hanging with a bunch of shoulds and oughts.
Right.
He provides actual doable advice that we can put into practice today.
Well, I'm definitely ready for some practical tips.
Okay.
What does he suggest we do to overcome these distractions and cultivate that heartfelt spiritual worship that God desires?
He offers 8 specific strategies. And what's interesting is they're not all about what to do during worship, but about cultivating a lifestyle that fosters deeper intimacy with God.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's his first piece of advice?
He starts by saying that we need to maintain spiritual frames outside of worship.
Okay, outside of worship.
Basically, he's saying that we can't expect to suddenly switch on our spiritual affections when we walk into church or sit down to pray.
Okay.
If we've been neglecting our relationship with God the rest of the week.
So it's about cultivating a lifestyle of spiritual awareness, not just compartmentalizing it to certain times and places.
You got it. It's about carrying that awareness of God's presence with us throughout the day, not just during designated spiritual times.
Right.
Kind of like how you're always aware of your phone.
Yeah.
Even when it's in your pocket.
That's a great analogy. I could definitely see how constantly checking in with God throughout the day would make it easier to connect with him during more formal times of prayer and worship. What are some practical ways to do that?
Charnock suggests incorporating prayer and spiritual reflection into our daily lives. Yeah. He even talks about secret ejaculations
Oh.
which I know sounds a little strange today.
Yeah, that one might need some updating for a modern audience.
Right.
Yeah.
What he's talking about is basically short, spontaneous prayers throughout the day.
Okay.
It's about acknowledging God in the midst of everyday life,
Yeah.
thanking him for his blessings, asking for his guidance, and simply communing with him in the quiet moments.
I love that. It takes the pressure off having these long, elaborate prayer sessions.
Right.
And makes prayer feel more accessible and integrated into my daily life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What's his second tip for cultivating spiritual worship?
Okay, what's number 2?
His second point flows directly from the first.
Okay.
Cultivate love for and dependence on God.
Okay, that makes sense. But love can be such a big, abstract concept.
Yeah.
How do we practically cultivate love for God?
He says we need to let love be the driving force behind our worship, not obligation or duty.
Okay.
When we truly love God, we want to spend time with him.
Yeah.
We want to pour out our hearts to him.
Right.
It's less about what we should do and more about what we long to do.
That really resonates with me. I know I've often approached prayer and Bible reading out of a sense of duty. Like it's something I have to do to be a good Christian.
Right.
But I can see how shifting my perspective to a place of love would completely change my experience.
Exactly. It transforms those have-tos into get-tos.
Yes.
I love that.
And when our hearts are filled with love for God, those distractions we talked about earlier naturally start to fade away because our hearts are already fixed on what matters most.
That's so good. What about dependence on God?
Yeah.
How does that play into cultivating spiritual worship?
He says we need to rely on God's strength.
Not our own.
Okay.
We need to recognize our own limitations.
Yeah.
And trust that he will meet us where we are and help us to grow in our love and devotion to him.
So it's about humility and surrender, acknowledging that we can't do it on our own.
Precisely.
Okay.
We need his help to fight off distractions.
Yeah.
To stir up those heartfelt affections. To experience true communion with him.
This is all so insightful. I'm really starting to see how these seemingly small shifts in perspective can revolutionize our worship life.
Right.
But I'm curious to hear more about what Charnock has to say. What's this third piece of advice for cultivating that heartfelt connection with God?
His third point builds on that idea of dependence by encouraging us to nourish correct conceptions of God in our minds.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It means meditating on God's majesty,
Okay.
his goodness, and his power.
Yeah.
We need to remind ourselves who we're actually dealing with when we approach him in worship.
So it's about cultivating a sense of awe and wonder.
Precisely.
Okay.
He says that low thoughts of God lead to low frames in us before him.
I see.
But when we truly grasp his greatness, how can we help but respond with reverence and adoration?
That makes perfect sense. It's not just about showing up and going through the motions. It's about preparing our hearts and minds to encounter the living God. I love how he's not just giving us practical tips, but also helping us to understand the why behind them.
Exactly. He's showing us that our outward actions flow from our inward beliefs about God. And the more we meditate on his character, the more our hearts will be drawn to him in love and adoration.
This is all so good. Ready to hear more?
Right.
What's Charnock's fourth piece of advice?
This one might be a bit challenging,
Okay.
but it's crucial. Avoid worldly desires.
Ah, yes, those pesky distractions we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Charnock warns that the world has a magnetic force that pulls us away from God.
Right.
It bombards us with messages that tell us to find our happiness and fulfillment in things that are ultimately fleeting and unsatisfying.
So he's not saying we have to become hermits and renounce all earthly pleasures, right?
Right.
It's more about finding a healthy balance.
That's a great way to put it. It's about making sure our affections for God are greater than our affections for anything else.
Right.
And when our hearts are cluttered with worldly desires, it's no wonder we struggle to focus on God and worship.
That makes so much sense. We can't expect our hearts to soar heavenward if they're weighed down by earthly baggage.
He makes another interesting point about this.
Okay.
He says that just as birds have more flutterings of their wings when they're first taking off from the earth, we'll experience more spiritual struggle when we're too entangled in worldly things.
I see.
But the further we ascend above the earth's pole, the steadier our flight becomes.
I love that analogy. It paints such a vivid picture of what it means to rise above the world's distractions and fix our gaze on God.
Right.
Like, we have to loosen our grip on earthly things
Yeah.
in order to truly take hold of the things of God.
You're getting it.
Okay.
And that leads right into his fifth point,
Right.
which is all about deepening our sense of need.
Okay, deepening our sense of need.
He says that when we truly understand what's at stake in worship,
Okay.
when we grasp the magnitude of what God offers us,
Hmm.
our lukewarm affections will vanish.
Okay, this is where I need some practical help. How do we actually cultivate that deep sense of need?
He says we need to be honest with ourselves about what we're truly longing for,
Okay.
what we're hoping to receive from God. Are we desperate for his forgiveness? Do we crave his presence?
Yeah.
Are we hungry for his wisdom and guidance?
So it's about coming to God with the beggar's heart, recognizing our utter dependence on him.
Exactly. He uses the example of a condemned man pleading for mercy.
Wow.
That's the kind of intensity we should bring to worship.
Okay.
We come to God not with a sense of entitlement, but with a humble recognition of our desperate need for him.
Wow, that's a powerful image. He also talks about being mindful of the supplies we've met with in former worship.
Yes, you're right.
Right.
He says that remembering those past encounters with God, those times when he has met our needs in extraordinary ways,
Yeah.
can rekindle those flames of affection in our hearts.
Wow.
When we recall how he's shown up for us in the past,
Yeah.
it fuels our faith and our desire to experience him again.
That's such a great reminder.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in the present moment
Right.
and forget all the ways God has been faithful to us in the past. But taking time to remember those moments of grace can help us to approach him with a renewed sense of awe and gratitude.
Exactly. It's about cultivating a heart of remembrance.
Yeah.
Acknowledging that God's faithfulness in the past is a guarantee of his faithfulness in the present and future.
Okay, this is all so good. We've covered 5 of Charnock's 8 points so far, and I'm already feeling so inspired to approach worship with a renewed sense of purpose. It's like he's helping me to peel back the layers of my heart and see what's really going on beneath the surface.
I'm glad to hear that. But we're just getting started.
Okay.
Charnock's got 3 more gems of wisdom to share, and they're just as practical and insightful as the first 5.
Okay. I can't wait to hear what he has to say next.
Mm.
This is exactly the kind of deep dive I needed to breathe fresh life into my spiritual journey. Welcome back to Contemporary Conversations on Christian Classics. We are wrapping up
Yes.
our exploration of Steven Charnock's The Existence and Attributes of God and his incredible insights on spiritual worship from Chapter 4.
It's been quite a journey through the heart of true devotion, hasn't it?
It really has. We've covered so much ground already, and I feel like I'm finally starting to understand what it really means to worship God in spirit and in truth, as Jesus said in John chapter 4, verse 24.
That's wonderful to hear. And you know what's really striking about Charnock's approach?
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't just point out the problem of half-hearted worship, but he actually gives us practical tools to overcome it.
Yes. We've already explored 5 of his 8 strategies. We talked about maintaining a spiritual mindset throughout the day, cultivating love and dependence on God,
Right.
nourishing our minds with right conceptions of him,
Yes.
and resisting the pull of worldly desires.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and recognizing our deep need for God.
That's right.
Yeah,
And now we're ready to dive into his remaining 3 points. Are you ready for more?
absolutely. Bring on the wisdom.
All right. So his 6th point is a bit counterintuitive.
Okay.
He says that if anything intrudes that might choke the worship,
Okay.
cast it out speedily.
So we're not supposed to just try to push those distractions aside and power through.
He's actually advocating for a more proactive approach.
Okay.
Don't just passively let those thoughts and feelings linger. Address them head on.
Okay. I'm intrigued. How do we cast out those intruders? Does this involve yelling at my to-do list?
Not quite.
Okay.
Charnock uses the analogy of weeding a garden.
Okay.
You don't stop to analyze each weed you see.
Right.
You just pull it up and toss it aside.
So we need to be ruthless with those distractions.
In a sense, yes. He's saying that we need to be single-minded in our pursuit of God. If something, even a seemingly good thing, is hindering our communion with him, we need to be willing to let it go, at least for that moment.
That makes sense. But it also sounds really hard.
Yeah.
Those distractions are persistent. It's like they have a way of sneaking back in, even when we think we've gotten rid of them.
You're absolutely right. It's a constant battle,
Yeah.
but a battle worth fighting.
Yeah.
And thankfully, Charnock doesn't leave us to fight it alone. His next point offers a powerful strategy.
All right, I'm ready for this secret weapon. What is it?
He says to lay hold of the most melting opportunities and frames.
Melting opportunities. I love that phrase.
It's a beautiful image, isn't it?
Yeah. He's talking about those moments when our hearts are especially tender towards God.
Yeah.
When we feel that spiritual stirring within us.
Oh, I know what you mean. Like when you're listening to a worship song.
Yeah.
And you just feel this overwhelming sense of God's presence, or when you're reading scripture and a particular verse just jumps out at you
Right.
and speaks directly to your soul.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Those are the melting opportunities Charnock is talking about. They're those moments of grace when God makes himself known to us in a special way.
So what are we supposed to do when those moments happen? Do we grab them and hold on tight?
He says, seize them.
Okay.
Don't delay. Don't let them slip away.
Okay.
Draw near to God in those moments.
Right.
Pour out your heart to him
Yeah.
and let him work in you.
Yeah. It's like becoming a spiritual opportunist, always ready to capitalize on those moments of grace.
I love that. Spiritual opportunists, always on the lookout for those divine appointments.
Those whispers of God's love breaking through the noise of everyday life.
Okay, I'm ready for his final point. What's the grand finale?
Yeah.
How do we wrap all of this up
Hi.
and put it into practice?
His final point is all about reflection and self-awareness.
Okay.
He says we need to practice self-examination at the end of every act of worship.
So, like a spiritual debrief.
Exactly.
Right.
He's encouraging us to take a moment to honestly evaluate how we engaged with God.
What kind of questions should we be asking ourselves?
He suggests things like, why was I so distracted today? What hindered my communion with God?
Okay.
Where did my heart wander? What were those starts of my heart trying to tell me?
That sounds a bit intense. It's like holding our hearts accountable.
It is, but it's also incredibly freeing because it allows us to identify those patterns of distraction, those areas where we need to grow.
It's not about beating ourselves up for our failures. It's about learning from them and moving forward in grace.
That's the key. He even encourages us to chide ourselves for any carnality we perceive,
Right.
but always with a view toward growth and transformation.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of what it means to worship God in spirit and in truth.
Me too. And what's so amazing is that these insights are just as relevant today as they were when Charnock first wrote them centuries ago.
Yes. The human heart hasn't really changed that much. We still struggle with distractions.
Right.
We still grapple with divided affections. And we still long for that deep, abiding connection with God.
And you know what I find so encouraging?
What's that?
Even though Charnock presents a very high view of worship, he also offers so much grace.
Yeah.
He acknowledges that our worship will never be perfect.
Yeah.
This side of heaven.
Yes. He reminds us that God sees the sincerity of our hearts.
Yes.
Even when our minds wander and our affections falter, he meets us where we are and gently guides us toward deeper intimacy with him.
And I think that's the key takeaway from this whole discussion. It's not about striving for some unattainable standard of perfection. It's about cultivating a posture of humility, surrender, and a genuine desire to know and love God more deeply.
So true. It's about inviting him into the messy reality of our lives, the distractions, the doubts, the fears, and trusting that he will meet us there and transform us from the inside out.
Beautifully said. It's in those moments of surrender that we truly experience the power and beauty of spiritual worship.
Well, I don't know about you, but I feel like I need to go spend some time in prayer after this conversation.
Me too. Let's carry these truths with us into our personal worship time and ask God to reveal any areas where we need to grow in our love and devotion to him.
That's a great idea. And for our listeners out there, if you're feeling challenged and inspired by this conversation, we encourage you to do the same. Take some time to reflect on what we've discussed and ask God to show you how you can cultivate a more spiritual approach to worship.
And remember, you don't have to do this alone. God is with you every step of the way, ready to guide you and empower you to experience the fullness of life that he has for you.
This has been such a rich and rewarding deep dive into Steven Charnock's The Existence and Attributes of God. I'm so grateful for your insights and wisdom.
I've enjoyed it too, and I'm so glad we could share this journey with you.
And for our listeners out there, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into timeless Christian content that continues to inspire today. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Contemporary Conversations on Christian Classics for more explorations of classic Christian works.
Until next time, may your hearts be filled with the joy of knowing and worshiping the God who is worthy of all our praise.